I'm Simon St. Laurent, co-chair of O'Reilly's OSCON conference. I'm here today with Mike Amundsen, director of API architecture and a forceful advocate for RESTful APIs and hypermedia.
Yep.
And it's a great time to be doing hypermedia. It's getting more and more notice. REST has been sort of building for the last decade or so. I feel like we're reaching points of new possibility. What kinds of fun things are you seeing?
Well, actually, there are a handful of things that, as you say, seem to be kind of coming together. You know, it was about around 2010, people started talking more about hypermedia and less about REST, which I thought was a really, really good idea, because it turns out that a couple of years before, Fielding, who is sort of the father of the REST pattern, the REST architectural model, explained what the hypermedia role was really in REST, and then people got interested in that. So over the last several years, I hear more and more people talking about hypermedia APIs the way they might have talked about REST APIs, which is really cool. There's another thing that's actually been brewing, which I think is really neat. Sort of the bellwether of something that's already arrived. Martin Fowler now talks about microservices, which I think is really, really cool. So microservices, of course, were around when we built Unix. Like, Unix is built on the notion of tiny little things. What's the phrase? Do one thing and one thing well, right? Mm-hmm. So now we're talking about microservices from the web point of view. And it turns out that tying these single services together with hypermedia links from place to place and passing state back and forth is now a lot easier to envision, a lot easier to make real than it was several years ago. So I think the fact that people are talking more about the notion of hypermedia, more about the notion of small services that do one thing and one thing well, means that we can start linking things together, and we may be getting to a point where the idea of these small services where an application is sort of created out of what's available rather than off one single server is a real possibility.
With all these small services, where does the application live?
Right. I think this is one of the challenging things. If you take this to its logical conclusion, the application is created by the client itself. So the client will compose an application from all these services. Maybe I have a little translator service that translates some language, and then I have a little service that goes out and works on social media and reads and writes data, and then I have maybe a service that extracts payments or handles payments. All of a sudden, I have a translation service where I can translate social media information for people on sort of a micro scale. So now I've created an application that no one single server owns. The client owns that.
Well, the dream in web services when it first got started was, being able to snap these pieces together and make them all go. And somehow we found ourselves with a lot too much glue in the middle. And it feels like hypermedia is much freer of glue. But how is it all coming together?
Well, hypermedia can be. That's the real challenge. So when I work with people who are working on projects like this, there's a sort of a natural tendency to want to own the whole thing or have the whole application in one place. And that's really kind of what we saw with the enterprise style of web services, right? There's a service that has all of these components in them or all these pieces in them, and you deal with that service to solve a problem, and then you go on to some other service to solve some other problem. The idea of actually using that service as part of the solution never really happened, because it's difficult for people to conceive that idea. So I think what's happening now is, as we start to get smaller and smaller service surfaces, it's easier for people to imagine using hypermedia. So hypermedia means not just a link, but also a form. So it means not just going from one place to another, but actually sharing state. Maybe I get a hypermedia form from a service that says, if you'd like me to translate this data, you need to give me the string and your token ID or something like that. Well, it'll actually explain that in the response, and then a application can say, oh, I know what a token ID is, and I have the string, so it passes it back, and then I get another piece, and then I take what I have, and I go to some other service which says, well, if you want to post this to social media, you need to give me your ID and the string to post to social media. So you begin to think of these things in much more discrete, and that would be stateless, as Fielding called it, more discrete pieces, and those discrete pieces add up to that application.
As you're calculating what pieces you need, one of the big questions is granularity. So as we get more and more micro, at what point do you kind of get too micro? At what point do you build back and get too huge? How do you how do you compose these parts into a unified whole?
Right. So I think there are two things. We know what it feels like to over-constrain, to overbuild, right? I'm not sure any of us really know what it's like to underbuild or to under-constrain. And I want to see what that's like. I would love to get to the portion where people say, gee, the problem is there are way too many services going on here, and I can't build a good application. I kind of think that's going to take a while, but I would love to be there. So, but I think like anything else, it's common sense. You sort of figure out, this is kind of difficult to put together, or this is difficult to get from A to B. I think one of the challenges we'll find as we start to work on these projects is if we create dependencies between items, we're going to build very, very brittle systems. Right? One of the beauties about the Unix model is there are no dependencies between grep and awk. They just are. And what you compose, what you create, is another matter. Now, you may get an error, and you may need to work on solving that problem, but there are no dependencies. I think one of the really fascinating things about building services right now today is I'm dealing with lots of people who are saying, well, we have to understand all the dependency problems. We have containers because we think we're trying to figure out dependency problems, right? We have the idea of the Phoenix server because we want to sort of minimize the math of dependency. Just put it all in a big ball and release it. So I think we have this ghost of dependency out there. And I think it's possible if we deal only in interfaces and in small pieces like the Unix model, I think we have a chance at doing this on the web level.
Well, on the web, some of these dependencies are actually between the services and between the systems. And so, yes, the client is bringing it all together, but how do you... It's a different set of questions for like looking at performance and looking at reliability, and how do you make sure that all stays harmonized?
Right. So I think so. There are two things, right? So there's dependency behind the interface, right? I expose an interface which does translation, right? Well, if I also am dependent or I'm using several other services, that's a danger, right? So now I have a sort of a discontinuous model. It's something that I can't quite control. That's certainly a danger that we need to work out, right? And it's hard in interface programming to know. The point is you're not supposed to know what's behind, so you don't know how many other hops there are in the pattern, right? So one of the ways that I think I've seen a lot of people dealing with this is asynchronicity, right? So the whole rise of Node and the popularity of Erlang and Go and several of these other languages is the fact that asynchronicity is built in. I don't have to wait around. I can go do something else. I think one of the things we need to see more of is parallelism, which is, yes, I need to do some translation, but I'm not going to be reliant on just one translator service. Maybe I'll use several behind my interface and let them sort of negotiate out what's going on. There's a gentleman in Paris, I believe, who was actually working on a standard or a way to grade the responsiveness of various parallel services, so you can actually use some heuristics to decide, well, this is a more dependable service for what I want. I'm going to do this one. Years and years ago, I worked in phone switch management. We would use different carriers on landlines, and we had all sorts of rules about which carrier we would use at which time of day based on what price and so on and so forth. So we may need to introduce some of that stuff from the 1960s and 70s into what we do in our web service. Right.
You've talked about, you had some good keywords there, danger and asynchronous, and then this whole models for switching things back and forth. When I talk to people about hypermedia, they don't always get it. Well, first they think I'm talking about 90s CD-ROMs, and we fixed that quickly. But the things that you just outlined are a lot of challenges for people to get this model in their heads. And how do you get through those and around those?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. You're right, exactly. When I first started talking about hypermedia a lot, I definitely got the 90s story, right? I got the Mark Bernstein story. I got the literary sort of version of that, and maybe moving up to the educational version, sort of the adaptive version, right? So it was still pretty difficult for people to think of hypermedia as a business software tool, although I see more and more of that today. So one of the things that I really try to talk to people about is the API. The I is interface, so you have an interface. So how do you explain that interface to someone? Leonard Bernstein, co-author that we did the RESTful Web APIs book together, Leonard has a great story on this. He basically says the way we work today is we use human-readable prose to explain how APIs work. and it's up to humans to read it and then write code to match it. It's as if back before we had the web, when we had BBSs and bulletin boards, we had written out versions of how you would go to a certain IP address and type this in, and then go to this folder and click on this, and it's step by step, and enter all these things until you finally got to the right place, rather than actually having a hyperlink to get there. Right? So we're still in that mode that we were in the BBS days of the early 90s when we come to business APIs. So getting away from human readable means getting toward machine readable. And one of the most effective machine readable ways to describe an API is hypermedia forms and links. So that's really where we start. So get people thinking about how I describe it in a way that a machine would understand, and almost always the most effective way to do that is with links and forms.
When you're explaining the story, and you've done it in books, you've done it in video, you do it at conferences, that's sort of the phase after the blank look, and people are starting to figure out the forms and links story. What kind of light bulbs do you see going off? How do the pieces come together for people?
I think one of the best experiences I had was actually at an event called RESTfest, which I co-chair with Benjamin Young every year in Greenville, South Carolina. Last year, Erik Mogensen came from Norway. We do a hack day every year. So someone sort of proposes a hack, and we all kind of decide what we're going to do. Erik came from Norway with this great idea about creating a bunch of worker bots to solve problems. So when we started working on the project, and everybody's there, he had some documents for us ahead of time. We all realized that we didn't understand the whole picture. We would just understand this one small job we were doing. And that Erik was actually sort of like the orchestra conductor. He would pass out jobs to individual bots. One does mapping, one does translating, one does math, one actually works out coordinates for some system or some switching of coordinates. He had all these things together, and then what happened is each one of us sort of had a role to play. What was really amazing in the experience as people started to talk is that was the first time I saw a large group of people have these light bulbs go off saying, oh, I understand when you create a hypermedia-based system, you're not actually solving one problem. You're actually creating an ecosystem where a bunch of problems could be solved. And that was, I think, a real light bulb moment for a lot of people in the room. It's a real challenge. When you create like a message model, a media type, like for accounting, right? So all the possible things you can do in accounting. You're not actually writing an accounting application. You're actually describing the accounting world, and other people make applications with that. And that's really what hypermedia starts to allow you to do. You can start arranging, as we talked about in the beginning, your own application that interacts with lots of things to create something that nobody else knows about except you. And I think I saw that bulb go off last year, and I've seen it go off a couple more times in the last year or so. And it's actually pretty exciting.
Yeah, this sounds great. I'm hoping we can create some more orchestra conductors, some more musicians, and make all these pieces come together. Thank you.
Yep, I hope so too.